Good evening and welcome back to all of you who have been here throughout the day. And for those of you who are coming just for this program, welcome to you. It's a very exciting program. If we could close the doors so that we, even though I know that may make it a little warmer in here, but we can open them eventually. It's a very exciting program and a very long-term project and process that is being discussed here today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Shattuck, the rector, the president and rector of the university. And I was, for those of you who were here during the day, I was the person whose name was used with the construction company to stop the drilling that was going on next door, which came apparently at a moment when you were talking about extraction. It seemed just about the right kind of thing to be doing. And I gather Danny Kaufmann here quipped that Exxon had arrived and they were in the process of drilling right next door. So I'm glad that that stopped, and we can assure you that it will not start up again. I will say, just so that you know what we're doing, it's an exciting project that we have at the university where we are building, among other things, a new campus and an international conference center. So if you come here in 2 years, you will find a much larger auditorium and much broader facilities for international conferences like the one that we are hosting here and this workshop that we're hosting on the resource curse over this couple of weeks period. So the drilling is not in vain, and it goes on in a good cause, but we won't have it happen during the time of your events. So our theme for tonight is a fascinating one. It's one in which most of you are completely immersed. Falling commodity prices, rising tensions, have countries learned from the past to navigate the future? And I certainly don't need to tell anyone in this room that we have discoveries happening all the time of oil and gas reserves, which are at least theoretically in a position to transform economies. But we also know that increased revenues from these oil and gas reserves, once they are drilled, as it appeared that they were being done next door here a minute ago, don't necessarily lead to positive socioeconomic development. That is an understatement. It's a statement that I think you can all understand. And we also know that even when the revenues are used for good purposes, today, with the commodity prices falling in these fields, there is a great pressure on the extractive industries and on, more importantly, those who should be benefiting from them because of the falling commodity prices. So we have a stellar group of policy mandarins, if I can call them that, and practitioners who have been assembled here this evening, who've worked on and changed the way people think about the resource curse, some of them from a practical point of view and some of them from a very broad global and somewhat theoretical point of view. And they will help us unravel the threads of this very complicated economic narrative that is captured by the title of this event. Our convener, but I know he'd much prefer to be called our provocateur and discussant, Danny Kaufmann, many of you know, has pioneered innovative approaches to measure governance and corruption throughout the world. He's done this both at the Brookings Institution in Washington and as director of the World Bank Institute, and he's now, of course, the president of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, which you all know is an advocacy organization deeply engaged in improving resource policies across the world. Sir Paul Collier of Oxford University is a public intellectual on resource governance and macroeconomic management. We're fortunate at our School of Public Policy at CEU to have Paul as a distinguished periodic visiting professor. He is a prolific author, as you know. His Bottom Billion won numerous prizes. His book, The Plundered Planet, offered concrete suggestions for how to fix global public policy problems that result from the improper exploitation of natural resources. Zeinab Camara is the founder and president of Women in Mining Guinea, an organization dedicated to ensuring that women's interests are at the forefront of the male-dominated mining sector in Guinea and Africa. She is a member of the Network of Women in Mining in West Africa, the chapter head of Guinea for Africa 2.0. She is a Tutu Fellow, an expert in sustainable social investments and partnership in the mining sector, and the manager of communities, performance and compliance for Rio Tinto Simandu. And finally, Juan Roberto Lozano Maya is an economist with experience on energy policy and planning issues. Previously, Juan worked at Mexico's Ministry of Energy. He's currently a researcher at the Asia Pacific Energy Research Center based in Tokyo, where he is leading 2 projects focused on the design of a policy framework for shale gas development and the implementation of mechanisms to facilitate LNG trade. So let me ask you to join me in welcoming this outstanding panel of discussants and provocateurs to lead us through this very complicated issue, which many of you are equally expert in. So please join me in welcoming them. Over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, John. Thank you for everybody who is here at the CEU attending this very special course and event. For those that are outside, because this is being webcast, welcome. And in fact, the idea, the objective is to have hundreds and hundreds of provocateurs here, and not only one, because this is such an important topic to be debated. It's fantastic to have Paul, to have Zeinab, to have Roberto with us on these very crucial issues. Before we get fully started, let me suggest that anybody wants to tweet, the hashtag is ResourceGov. There's also a web page at our NRGI website, which is on resourcegov.org. And we look forward for a lot of interaction during this panel. The way we're going to do it, after my very brief initial remarks, we'll turn to Paul, who will be addressing a key issue related to the topic today, which is called Falling Commodities, Rising Tensions. Have countries learned from the past to navigate the future? But more simply put, what the hell happened? And what needs to happen next? And Paul, everybody knows, is global expertise and eminence on the topics both in mining, oil, natural resources, and much more generally in development. And it's fantastic to have also Roberto, who brings experience and expertise from Mexico, a major country which has been recently embarking on extremely ambitious reforms, as well as, since you work with, with APEC, and you live in Tokyo, your expertise on China and many other APEC countries will be fantastic to have in this panel. And Zeinab, from your expertise, not only in terms of Guinea, but also your corporate links and work, as well as your civil society, your fantastic civil society advocacy work. And then we have enormous expertise, around the 60 participants here for this 2-week course, as well as many other guests from CEU in this auditorium, which I will also be involving and expect you to be provocateurs. Essentially, after Paul's master lectures that he gave most of the day, and then you went to a board meeting, and then I gave a presentation, a briefer presentation, but basically looking at data. What the data is showing is that over the past decade or so, and that was a super cycle, the big boom, governance, on average, on balance, did not improve in the resource-rich countries. The great thing about average is that it hides a lot of variation. So there are a few countries that show that, yes, it can be done, and good things can happen, and reforms are happening. But that's a minority. Then there is another minority, which unfortunately is not too small, where things even deteriorated in some governance dimensions, including voice and democratic accountability, civil society space, shrinking, government effectiveness did not improve. And then there's a lot in the middle, which didn't improve. So there's a serious question there as to what happened and why and what lessons to draw that from the future. It's very preliminary, and we're doing some research on this issue already. A lot of experts from NRG are involved in these questions, which is so important. What happens at times of boom, at times of bust or decline of commodity prices, which may be very much relevant for the coming years. And there is some suggestion in the evidence that the behavior of resource-rich countries which are oil-dependent is different than those, or hydrocarbon-dependent, oil and gas is different than the mining-dependent economy. So I look forward to the difference, since some of you come from an oil-dependent economy, others, like Zeinab, from a mining-dependent economy. We tend to lump them together as natural resources, when in fact the dynamics may be quite different one to the other. So I look forward also to insights from the eminent panel, as well as from the audience on that question. Let's unpackage it. All producers, for a variety of political economy, other reasons, the dynamics may be different than in mining-rich countries. So without further ado, let me turn to Paul now with that very overarching question from your global expertise. What happened and where should we be going?
Yeah, thanks, Tony. I've spent quite a lot of my energies the last 10 years trying to, and my catchphrase for a while was never again, that where the idea was that poor countries had been through the commodity boom of the 80s and generally hadn't got much to show for it, that it was a missed opportunity. And so the never again was to say, let's learn what went wrong there, and this time is going to be different. And if you think about it, there was, compared to the previous commodity boom, it really was night and day in terms of international effort. So international awareness enormously increased. Publish What You Pay, Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, Natural Resource Charter, a whole array of stuff, a lot of attention from the international agencies, a lot of awareness most importantly, in poor societies themselves. So a lot was done. And that wasn't a failure. But if we have to have an honest assessment of the super cycle, now it's over, I think we have to conclude that to a considerable extent it was another missed opportunity. And so we're still back with the proposition never again, and we've got to learn the lessons from what went right and wrong in the super cycle, what was achieved and what wasn't achieved. We need to learn those lessons quickly. And now is a really good time to learn those lessons. Partly, the people who took these decisions are often still around. They're in power. And in a sense, they need to have their noses rubbed into the fact you're in a mess now because of what you yourselves did. But secondly, now's the time when inevitably there's going to be a lot of pain. And living through that pain is a very good time for citizens to focus on, if we'd done things differently, we wouldn't have had all this. And so it's a major opportunity to actually draw the right lessons. Right? And in the class, I gave the examples of both Germany and Argentina went through hyperinflation. And for Germany, it only went through it the once because it learned. And Argentina keeps going through it again and again because citizens have never learned the right conclusions. So drawing the right conclusions from a disappointing experience is very important. Now, what went right and what went wrong? I think there actually was a lot more transparency this time than last time. A lot more. And so, to my mind, on the transparency front, I would say there's been quite a bit of success. By no means complete, but a lot of progress. A lot of progress. Where I think there's been really serious failure is, and let me say on taxation, I think there's been some progress. Some progress. I think more work needs to be done on that to just measure, but my sense is that governments were much more clued up and savvy in negotiating with companies. There's still a long way to go, but I think it was a lot better. Where I think things went really badly wrong was in how money was used. In a sense, the global financial crisis saved a lot of poor countries from worse because it closed borrowing markets down for a while. And so there was only a very short period when commodity prices were high and sovereign bond markets were open. And so there was a limited ability of very poor countries to rush back into debt. But they did so. They did so. And on the whole, they didn't do investing in investing. They didn't build a capacity to invest well. And indeed, a lot of the impetus for the borrowing was consumption. And so I think the big failures were in the passage from revenues to productive investment. That's, to my mind, the core challenge. And I think there was also, and this is a very important failure, there was a failure to communicate to citizens beyond the agenda of transparency. And inadvertently, what the agenda of transparency communicated to citizens was, you can't trust your government. But if that's the only thing that's communicated to citizens, it's debilitating. I mean, what needed to be communicated to citizens is, your government's got a huge job to do harnessing this stuff for the next generation. So the core communications message needed to be around, in my view, around stewardship. And it wasn't. Stewardship was hardly heard at all. And that actually exacerbated, that combined with the intensified suspicions of government, created the problem that the only way that governments could, as it were, get citizens off their back was the high visible recurrent spending increases. And so paradoxically, the emphasis on transparency with nothing else fueled the need for governments to go into sovereign bond markets, borrow money, and shower people with money that's going to be paid for by their children. So instead of building children's future, we saddled the next generation with a load of debts, whilst that financed a party for the current. And that was the inadvertent combination of the emphasis on transparency and, as it were, the criminalization of government, often with good cause, without an equivalent emphasis on a positive role for government. You've got a job in hand, please do it. Please build the future for our country. Thanks. Sorry, that was an awful long answer to the question.
Well, extremely thoughtful and also provocative one, particularly the notion of criminalization of government, which we should come back to. But there are so many thoughts there, and we will be coming back to that.
So you're not the only one that can play provocateur.
No. And one question, of course, about the transparency agenda. Yes, a lot of progress, and there's so much more awareness about transparency, but maybe it was also very narrow and a more technical aspect of transparency, and effective transparency in terms of translation to accountability and to the ability of citizens and the media to take advantage of that transparency, which is related to the communication issue, did not happen as effectively as it could have happened. Transparency, a lot of the transparency of the focus and the gains were on revenue transparency, would you say is as much on contracts, and therefore was it fully exposed and known to the citizens, to the other, and enough scrutiny that some countries were not getting as good deals as we're finding out now. So there's even a question that I hope comes also to your views, both from Zeinab and Roberto, from your countries, as to whether the transparency agenda it's almost finished, or there's an enormous work ahead on that one as well. And then there's a question, of course, to what extent maybe it's not as shocking what happened over the past 10 years during the super cycle because of the political incentives, when there are times of boom, which obviously leads to the question, well, maybe now is the time to engage on serious reforms that would be much harder for them to happen when there's such boom times, particularly maybe in oil-rich countries. So let's turn now to perhaps Mexico and the other countries you know about Roberto, particularly given the enormous ambition and break from the past, from generations in the past, of having been in the past century in terms of energy policy, natural resource policy, to basically you are in the midst of a major leap forward. To what extent the falling commodity prices and what's happening now that makes these reforms even more urgent, or that brings new obstacles to them, and so on. And then if you can suggest also on what Paul said in more general terms, what you think are lessons related to China, which is so important for all of us, and then you know about too.
Hello. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this invitation. I appreciate this opportunity to talk with all of you. Now, in regards to Mexico, well, just to provide a brief background, Mexico, I think it's a very good example of good governance, and especially in terms of oil and gas, natural resources, in the sense that Mexico remained closed for 76 years or something like that. But when I mean closed, it was strictly closed to any kind of foreign investment in the oil and gas sector since the nationalization of the oil industry many decades ago, for nearly a century. So the main point is that I want to stress here is that the times are changing, and I think that many countries are recognizing this. One very good valuable point that having stressed here is that the fact that as long as countries and economies keep depending on oil-based revenues, or for that matter, natural resource-based revenues, it's really it may pay off in the short term, but in the long term, it's going to be a really serious damage. It's going to harm the economy, and I think in some way Mexico recognizes this because my country has been very fortunate in having one of the super giant fields, Cantarell, and for many years, basically what they did was just to sip it like like soda, and it went all the way. All this oil and gas there from Cantarell. The government all of a sudden has these windfall revenues. So basically what they did is just, we had this monopoly due to the law, and basically what they did was to bring more people to have a bulky payroll, but at the same time they neglected all these more urgent priorities, social-based. Even in the industry as a whole, they neglected investments. The oil industry suffers from a chronic underinvestment, lack of technical capabilities. So at the very end, what happened is that, and this is a very good example. Again, I think the Mexico didn't know or didn't want to manage properly and appropriately these revenues. So basically, what happened is that when Cantarell fell down, and very steeply, by the way, they just realized that if we don't do something rapidly, we're running out of gas, literally, and of oil. So even in spite of many attempts of changing the law, because this is enacted in the Mexican Constitution, it was very interesting that Mexico could take that step, that political step. I would say as well that it was a matter of timing, a matter of luck as well. But at the very end, the reform was passed, and I think, I don't remember any other country maybe that had this situation where absolutely no foreign investment was allowed, and all of a sudden it is allowed now, and it is actually very open in the sense that many fiscal regimes, many options, lots of resources in Mexico, conventional, unconventional, deep shore, deep water, onshore, offshore, and the point is that I think this illustrates that you really need to take these changes, but if you're not addressing or if you're not implementing the proper governance issues, some things may persist, and I think this is what's happening in Mexico right now. So even though they have passed the energy reform, well, it remains to be seen whether these benefits for the Mexican citizens and the sector as a whole will ever be delivered, especially considering that the time now for falling oil prices is not very convenient. Now, I would just like to add a very brief comment in terms of other countries, for that matter, in Asia Pacific. It's very interesting that in one report ongoing, which is going to be published soon, about shale gas. Well, I don't want to enter very much into the controversy of discussion on shale gas, but one point is that shale gas is different from conventional oil and gas. And one thing we found in China, for example, is that even though China is a centralist, command-driven economy, and especially in terms of the oil and gas sector led by these three monster national oil companies, it's very interesting that even there they are starting to implementing open access to pipelines, and they are granting access as well to international oil companies to get this expertise about how to tap these shale resources, and as well the creation of a market-based price mechanism. That was just this. I finalized with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Any major obstacle now in Mexico that you see looming because of the falling commodity prices? Any?
Yeah. Well, for me, in my personal opinion, and I think now that I don't work for the government anymore, I'm much more critical. I can say, I mean, what I think. But one point I think it's very urgent in Mexico is that I think it was this point was stressed here. It's no sufficient that you have the rules and the institutions if you don't have transparency, if you don't have accountability or governance addressed. So basically, what happens is that, well, you may know this, but Mexico is suffering right now from I would say a high-level crisis of credibility. Lots of issues about conflict of interest coming actually straight from the president. So that is not giving a very good image of what has been done, even in spite of the milestone reform. And I would say as well that the lack of the freedom by the press, it's another concerning issue, which is related to the fact that the rule of law is not enforced completely in my country. Thank you.
Thank you. On that note, let's move to Guinea and your vast experience both with the private sector, civil society, and you also watch government very closely.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity, Dan. And I'm going to start by presenting Guinea, because having spoken to some of the colleagues here, not many had a background on where Guinea was and what we're doing in the natural resources space. So Guinea got independent in the 1950s, a Francophone country, and we've been dealing with the natural resources from the start. Guinea depends on the natural resources represent 20% of our budget, and 80% of the revenues from export. So you can see that it really depends on the mining resources. So the volatility of the natural resources prices has had a great impact on Guinea development. Prior to 2011, we had an unstable political landscape, as most of the African countries. And but still, because there was the booming in natural resources, revenues were coming in, but sadly were mismanaged. And 2010, we had a new government, elected government in place, and we were still in the boom, natural resources booming. So there was a lot of investment and potential, promises of investment in the mining sector. We have one of the biggest mining projects in the country, which is the Simondo project, an iron project. We've got bauxite, and we are one of the 6 exporter of bauxite in the world. So very large potential. But until now, we have not been able to get the benefit from that, whether from the government or from the people. So I would like to take this conversation more from the economic side of things to the social side of the impact of commodity prices. And one of the impact is local governance. Within the Guinea mining code, 0.4% of mining benefits should go to local government. So because the investment has decreased, local government revenues have reduced, which has created a lot of tensions and expectation, because a lot of local employment, local SMEs are linked to the mining sector. Local content is very big. And the small businesses that were created around the mining needs and potential, because that's how it is. So we've seen a lot of young entrepreneurs losing their homes because they took loans to be able to provide services to the mining sector, and then the boom started. Some of the projects stopped, and now they need to reimburse the loans. Some of the youngsters got married because they got employed, they had a stability within their job, and then they were laid off because some of the project left. So the impact on the commodity prices has been huge. But on the other side, I think the government has done a lot of progress within the governance of the mining sector since. And I believe they took the opportunity of the prices decrease to look ahead and to make sure that they put mechanisms in place when the ramp up or the boom start again. So in terms of governance, the mining code has been put in place and ratified. We have more community and civil society involvement in the natural resources discussions, which were not the case in previously. And the EITI Guinea was part of the EITI, was certified for the first time. As a country certified for EITI, and we got a lot of other governance structures that are trying to put in place. Capacity building of the administration is one of the biggie as well. Because how can we have a $20 billion project into a country where we lack capacity in the government, we lack capacity into the communities, we don't have enough workforce to be able to respond to the needs of major projects. So how can you make sure that we prepare the SMEs, we prepare the workforce, and we prepare the landscape within the government to receive such huge project into the country. And I believe that's the way the government is doing by the symbols they're sending, because we will not see the impact now, but it will be in 5 or 10 years' time. But we can see the symbols that have been sent by the government by ticking the boxes of what Sir Collier was saying. A lot of things that we saw on his presentation, made me think about what Guinea is doing. In terms of governance in the natural resources, but one thing that we need to take into account is civil society is critical to make sure that that we monitor those mechanisms that have been put on paper. So the government have set up an interministerial decree where we'll have more coordination on natural resources. So not only the Ministry of Mine taking the lead, but other ministries also involved. The decree has been signed, but the implementation is taking time. So there have been a lot of programs put on capacity building. Yes, the paper has been signed, but the implementation is taking time. So it's really critical that the civil society, the local actors, should be more involved in making sure that those reforms, those legislative laws are put in place by the government.
And what's one most important reform that would you suggest when you are asked by local government leaders, by mayors and others, okay, how do we do better next time around? What should we do? In addition, of course, capacity building, institutions need to be built, but what's the main lesson? Because many of the things you just said, Zeinab, at the local level is a mirror of the issues discussed previously of what we're learning, the lessons at the national level, obviously, and that it has this domino effect, and compounded by the fact that institutional capability at the local level sometimes it's even weaker. But are there mechanisms, policies, or one or two particular reforms that at the local level they should do more, that is not being sufficiently?
But I think it needs to come from the national level. We got a lot of the mining code and those reform. But what I tend not to see is a whole vision of the mining sector. What do we want to use the natural resources for? The last politique nationale, so the last strategy on mining in Guinea, was done in 1986. That was the vision. Then we had the codes, the mining code in 95 and the last one in 2011. But what I want to see is not only the application, the legal application of the laws. I want to see the strategy. What can we use? I think it's the discovery and deciding part of it. What do we want to use our natural resources for? What do you want to use our infrastructure project for? Which is really important first. And then we'll take it from there, build the capacity, take the right decision, implement those decisions on time.
Great. So that's a great bridge leading back to Paul, because it relates to your whole point about harnessing of resources and the whole strategic vision. You also made that point that you have made it before about communication, about the failure of communication and informed citizen. And I like to push you on that, and I think for everybody it will be a very interesting discussion and debate. Okay, well, how much is that? Is that plain ignorance by citizens, or it's more of a sophisticated issue where governments are failing in communicating properly? What does that mean if we start unbundling countries into those where there is nowadays a civic space? The great thing about Africa over the past 10, 15 years is that in many countries, not in all, but civic space has opened up, and yet maybe governments have not step up to the plate in communicating properly and managing expectations. That's Africa. In the Middle East and Central Asia, civic space is being closed at the dizzying space. So what does it mean, non-informed citizens in Azerbaijan? That's what we're planning. So shouldn't we unbundle that? We know what's happening in Russia, in other countries. Even you, Roberto, mentioned Mexico. Of course, it's all relative, and Latin America has been a major opening up. So what happens in those countries where civic space is closing versus those that are open, it should be unbundled. And then The other category of countries I would categorize for, even if it's simplistic, fig leaf countries. What about the Venezuelas, even the Ghanas, and so on, that all of a sudden say, look what's happening to us because of the falling commodity prices, when in fact, all what the falling commodity prices is doing is unmasking, making it totally naked, their major failures in policies and in governance for a very, very long time. And it's their woes is not really because of that, it's unmasking their incredible failure to act, particularly in the cases like Venezuela, but a number of others which are fig leaf countries. Can we say it was a failure to communicate of communication in those places? So if you could unbundle it a bit more, and because it means different prescriptions and policy implications for different sets of countries.
Yeah, I think this first of all, natural resources are peculiar in that the scope for citizen misunderstanding, systematic citizen misunderstanding, is enormous. And so I would say the default option, unless there is a very big effort both internationally and from the government and from informed civil society, the default option is pretty awful. The default option is grossly inflated expectations, is disputes over ownership, who does it belong to, local, national, what have you. The inflated expectations combined with the emphasis on transparency without anything else makes people so suspicious of government. Why hasn't it delivered the great wealth that I hear is there? That drives drives government into doing the exact opposite of stewardship. Instead of building assets, they build debts. So that is the default option on the communication battle. Then you've also got a default option on the governance side. I mean, in one sense, your result that governance didn't deteriorate during a commodity boom is actually rather good news, because the default option on governance is that natural resource wealth increases the incentive on the crooks in government to weaken checks and balances. The checks and balances are in the way of them and the loot. And so if the loot is more valuable, the pressure to undermine the checks and balances which preserve decent governance intensify. So the default options are terrible. On communications, it's deep misunderstanding. And in governance, it's deterioration. And so that's what you're struggling against. That's the peculiarity of natural resource rich countries, is that when the opportunities arise, the misunderstandings deepen and the governance worsens. And so the communications challenge is that somebody, and it can only be communications basically happen within countries, has got to disseminate all this. The international organizations make things worse. Because when does the IMF come into natural resource rich countries? Not during the boom. During the boom, they have nothing to do. These countries have got money. When do they come in? Now. When there's prices have come down, and there's a crisis. And what do the IMF typically say? It says, here's the policy recommendation, recipes you need. You've got to do them in return for my money. And then the government says, oh, terribly sorry, citizens. Here's all this awful pain that you've got to suffer because of the IMF. This is not our choice. It's nothing to do with us. It's these evil guys from Washington. So that deepens the misunderstanding. So that's the cycle we went through last time. You know, I'm holding my breath whether we go through it again. Has the IMF learned? You know, I don't know.
Okay. Well, one great thing about Paul is that you don't discriminate in terms of.
I'm an equal opportunity insulter.
So it's obviously
on that happy note, I'm going
to governments, citizens, and now the IMF and other such organizations, which anyway may be another fig leaf in this context. Thanks. And on that note, let me turn to Roberto and then to Zeinab, because a salient issue that came up also in your previous comments and relates to Paul's comment is the whole question about accountability. So, okay, informed citizens, fine, but you were both pointing to either issues of closing civic space or problems with civil society in terms of applying more pressure. What are the real obstacles and what's needed next for more effective accountability so that citizens, abetted by more transparency, abetted by better information and so on, can help and apply the appropriate pressure and information for reforms? Roberto first. And then we'll turn to all of you, the experts in the room, as well as, by the way, online. You have the Twitter handle. The Twitter, again, is resourcegov, hashtag resourcegov, and feel free to ask any question you wish.
Thank you very much. Well, I think accountability is crucial for any kind of deal, and especially in these terms, natural resource-based deal or regime to work effectively. So in that sense, one thing that is really crucial, like I said, is stakeholder engagement. I think, especially maybe with the exception of the United States and some extent Canada, but that's very small share. Especially for oil and gas, the ownership of these resources is mostly retained by the state. So basically, many people are left like, okay, but if we are allowing these natural resources, this oil and gas to be developed, what do we gain from that? And in some cases, I think this link is not very clear. And one thing to make it clear to citizens, to stakeholders, is the fact, like Paul said, one of that is that not to hype expectations, not to play with that, because in many cases, maybe for the sake of political capital, political advantages, governments usually do that. But the other thing that I think is crucial is accountability, so that citizens know really what is done with the value of the resources. Because at the very end, even though it's kind of demagogic, but those resources belong to the people. So if you don't enforce and if you don't follow and track and monitor accountability and transparency, I think whatever you do at the very end, I mean, in the short term, maybe you will get some benefits and people will get, I don't know, higher wages and economic spillovers. But at the very end, if you do not support it, if you don't underpin it with long-term principles of transparency, accountability, I don't think it will ever be sustained. And what's worse, it could backfire and actually be contested by citizens, by other type of stakeholders, and it could actually be worse off than if you had never ever implemented those reforms. That's my
You're
point.
working now with APEC.
That's right.
In Tokyo.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to push you to name the worst performers in this context, but who would you point out as which countries as having made significant progress on these issues of accountability in general, and it doesn't have to be only natural resources, in the past few years that shows that it can be done? Who are the best performers in your view in that group?
In that sense, I think Canada is one of the best, if not the best, in terms of oil and gas, natural resources. Australia as well. Even it might be noted here that even though in these two countries, states or provinces in Canada retain the legal right to determine whether or not to engage into oil and gas development, they are really doing a very good job in terms of well, listen to the people, doing consultations, approaching stakeholders, and especially in the sense of regulation. The government is not only passive in terms of devising the policy and then just expecting things to be done. They are really pushing forward very attractive, aggressive policies to evolve just in harmony with whatever happens in the industry. So at that point, I think it's a very we explored that idea today about the vicious cycles and virtuous cycles, and I think in that sense it's very good because the industry tries to exceed. To overdo the regulations in place to get the social license. And at the very end, the regulators come up with more stringent regulations, of course, to oversee and to ensure the local benefits to communities. And at the very end, it creates a positive cycle, a virtuous cycle that at the very end, I think, creates mutual gains and benefits everyone.
I think we're about to have a very interesting debate. I will turn to the audience very soon, and there is another expert from Canada here, and the question is virtuous versus vicious cycle, and to what extent the flip side may not be a risk too of regulatory capture by the vested interest of the corporates and a government that maybe ideologically is very well predisposed towards the industry view. And the fact is that Canada, compared with the UK and others in the EU, has been so much lagging behind in adopting mandatory disclosure requirements for oil, gas, and mining, although there has been some progress lately, and there's a lot of hope, but they're not there yet. So it's interesting that you mentioned Canada, which would not have been at the top of my list yet, although we're all hoping for the best. You can comment that, but I'll get very soon the others involved in this debate. But go ahead. You were going to, if you had one comment, go ahead.
I was just saying that in that point, Canada, I would like to say that it has especially evolved, I think, in the last maybe 5 years or something. They even streamlined the regulations. They have now a one-stop shop. So yeah, like you said, this wasn't I think one point that we need to realize here is that changes do not happen overnight. It's kind of a process that it has to be put. You need to put the seed and then expect to happen, to occur. But it will not be overnight. So, but it will happen if you have all the consensus and the political will and the acceptance of the community. And in that sense, I think it was very remarkable that in a relatively short period of time, they accomplish very significant milestones. Yeah.
Great. Zeinab, your perspective.
All right, thank you. I think from my perspective in the country, you talk about citizen involvement when there's a level of education where people can be engaged, can get engaged in such discussion as natural resources, taxation, and etc. The issue we've got is the lack of leadership even at the communities level to be able to discuss with the government or understand the impact of the mining or natural resources on people's life. They just know that there's a huge project and then we want to benefit now. And no communication is done from the government side. So all they know that we're going to get employment for our children. We're going to get our lands will be taken away from us. So we need to be compensated now. So the whole process of education is critical. So people have a basic knowledge of what natural resources management is, or even just understanding the impact, the positive impact sometimes of mining project on their life. So first of all, education. Secondly, the government has done great effort in publishing all the contracts that were signed. I think that was a great way of progressing with public information. But there's they needed to go further. Publishing all the contracts on the internet where 80% of the population does not have access to the internet. I don't see what's the impact. So one way to go further is consultation, as most of mining companies do. For example, for the environment and social impact assessment, they do consultation, stakeholders engagement, and they have to have the approval of people on the ground to be able to progress and have those papers validated by the government. So I believe the government should also do the exercise on going through the people, explaining what the project is about, and at the beginning of the project, not when all the papers have been signed, and then saying that we've just signed a $10 billion deal and the impact will be this, and we expect you to understand. No, the process needs to be from the forefront. At the exploration level, because the communities will see people coming up, in and out, and they will believe that yes, everything is done at the capital level. So they need to be engaged from the start, get the approval at all the phases, and for doing that, we need to create the platform to have the public sector, to have the private sector, and the communities, the civil society as one group to see what are the benefits that people will be reaping from the investment, but because otherwise it creates a lot of pressure on the private sector. So now I'm going to have my corporate hat on as a community manager, because a lot of the communities expect a lot from the private sector in terms of infrastructure, health, education, because the government has not had the capacity to be able to provide that to the communities. So the only people that they've got, in front of us, sometimes at the private sector. So how to make sure that we amend that we can define the fine line between the government's role, the private sector's role, and also the community leaders' role, because they have a role to play in this, to be able to avoid conflict in that. So that's a platform that I think should be put in place from the government to make sure that all the preoccupations and concern from all of the actors are taken into account. But the steps are there, but we just need to go further.
Great. And in fact, it should be noted, everybody should know. First, Zeinab you're not only talking in theory, in the abstract, and in analysis because you're doing this.
Yes,
you're doing
exactly.
this on the ground, and you're involved in this. Second, Guinea is a pioneer in contract transparency in general, and in fact, since I give a lot of hashtags and websites and so on, we have another one. It's partnership with other organizations, resourcecontracts.org. And Guinea is a pioneer there in having all these contracts online, and now it's being populated with many other countries. And I encourage everybody to look at that. And it's also no secret that Rio Tinto, which you are associated with as well, has been quite forthcoming in terms of transparency, both in terms of revenues and now in terms of contracts in Guinea and so on. And of course, giving your multiple representations. I'm not going to ask you to criticize Rio Tinto. Instead, the broader question, why is it that some companies, particularly in mining, have jumped aboard this train of transparency and disclosure by industry, that while the oil sector is still very much behind, with a notable exception now in terms of a giant of Statoil in Norway that recently decided it's about time, and now they're publishing in very much in detailed revenues for every country. And so have smaller companies like Tullow Oil and Cosmos and Talisman. But the other big oil companies are still very much behind. And that relates to the previous observation. And there, I want to clarify to Paul before. Yes, we do see some deterioration in governance dimension over the past 10 years during the super cycle, particularly on oil-rich countries, not so much in mining-rich countries, but related to this progressive notion in industry. We do not see it enough among big oil. They're staying behind, and they're still fighting against these transparency regulations and laws and so on. Why is that different, since you know the mining sector very well?
Yeah, and I think the mining sector has changed for the past 15 years. The big companies now are also regarding more the sustainable development of the project in Africa. Last February we were in Durban for the mining conference, and I think 20% of all the sessions were on sustainable development, because you cannot pretend to develop projects in Africa in such complex environment without taking into account the impact that it has on the country. So that's one thing. Secondly, the reputation of mining companies. Before we had a lot of the mining industry was closed. Now it's opening a lot more, because you've got more international attentions on the project. So you've got the AITI now that is in place. You've got the U.S. Anti-Bribery Act that was also in 2000. So you've got a lot of international regulations in place. So people are more regarding on what you are doing far away in some African countries. So big companies are more, mining companies are more aware of that. So that's why Rio Tinto has been one of the leaders in publishing our reports. And for what we pay, because for us it's really important. We have a lot of projects in Africa, so it's really important that we build that partnership with African countries, because we are there for long term. So from that perspective, I think mining companies will have to follow suit, and at some point, oil and gas companies also will have to.
Great. Let's open it up, and let me encourage also some views from Asia. I see Fabi, a great expert from Indonesia. Indonesia is a fascinating case. I just visited your country, as you know, in terms of both the prevailing challenges but also the opportunities. So it will be interesting to hear, particularly in the context of the falling oil prices. At the end of the day, some of these oil gas or mining-rich countries may even be net importers, which is what's happening in Indonesia for a variety of perverse reasons. So the impact may vary significantly from one country to the other, depending on that. There is also expert academic from China in the course that will be very much encouraged to participate. And obviously we'll hear the views from the Canadian experts. So who wants to go first in terms of those? And of course, we want to also encourage the views from Africa, many from Myanmar, from Central Asia, and so on. Who wants to go first? Fabi, right next to you. If you introduce, everybody should introduce themselves and from which organization, name, organization, and country.
Thank you. My name is Fabi Tumiwa. I'm with the organization Coalition for Essential Service Reforms, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. I think for Indonesia, just presently, I mean, we actually face two main problems. First of all, that our oil production is declining very, very fast. Even this year, from the lifting target of the country, so far we only achieve 80–85% of the lifting target of this year. So like barrel per day. So, and the second problem is that oil price also still unstable, getting declined, and so these two combinations hit a lot our fiscal capacities. I mean, the revenue from oil and gas definitely reduced, and the immediate impact is actually the government has to rationalize some spending, and we have a new government that just elected 6 months ago with a very big plan to invest more on infrastructure, but because of this, then the government have to think other way. Well, increasing tax is one of the options to cover the declining revenue from oil and gas this year. But that's also the problem, because with the current, so-called economic crisis, our export is also lower, and then that means that the tax from export is also lower. And also, since the government banned now export of the ore, mineral ore, and that's also have some impact to our export revenue, and also tax related to that. So that's that's what happens. And I think for, in a subnational context, because we have share a scheme to share the revenue to the some local government. Some of the local government also suddenly face this, and for some local government, oil and gas revenue contribute about 50 to 60% of their income. So I mean, well, while in the national context, maybe there are more options for government to manage this situation, but less option or very limited option for local government to deal with this issue. I think we're still observing, and then maybe there will be more better progress in terms of how to address this problem, especially in the local level.
Let me push you. What about the mining law, which has been pending for how many years? Look at the example of Guinea, and they did. And if that's not clarified, they don't clarify the rule of the regulator versus the producer, and clarify also for foreign investors. Isn't that a major break? What about the SOE, the state-owned enterprise?
You mean the oil and gas law? Yeah, I mean the
oil and gas law, and then the mining law later. Right?
The oil and gas law, of course, because of the constitutional issues with that, because the Constitutional Court decided in 2011 that the law is unconstitutional, and that's create kind of a limbo in terms of regulatory framework for oil and gas investment. That's also the reason why there is in terms of explorations are getting declined in the last 5 years because of that. And again, the problem with this with the low oil price now, we have seen that a number of companies already revised their exploration activities for this year and perhaps for next year. So there will be even more problem in the next 3 to 5 years in terms of number of oil you can produce because of the low exploration activities nowadays.
Okay. So that's needed, and then mining law later, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. What's next? Maybe Odea? Yeah.
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. Thank you. My name is Lucas Catera. I am working with the research. It's on. Okay. My name is Lucas Catera. I am working with the research institution in Tanzania that is focusing on growth and development. I'll just give the Tanzanian experience in terms of managing expectation, which I think is the problem that we are currently facing in the country. Recently, there has been discovery of the natural gas in southern part of Tanzania, and we have been having natural resources in mining for the last 20 years. And the experiences is that the communities around the areas where minerals has been extracted have never benefited from the extraction of minerals. Consequently now, what is happening in the southern part of Tanzania, they feel like they have learned a lesson that people in the communities where natural resources are discovered never benefit from them. So because of that, there are a lot of riots and tension in those areas where, in the southern part of Tanzania, where the natural gas has been discovered. But again, the big challenge of the government is that the government would like to maximize revenue all over the country because the natural resources belong to not only the southern part, but the whole of the country. The opposition party would like now to use that loophole to create the enmity between the government and the communities. So it's like you people in the southern Tanzania have been left out for quite some time. They are very soon will be rich, but if you're not careful, you will still remain poor because the government will take your resources to the rest of the country. So I think there is a problem because of that, there has been a lot of expectation that, okay, the wealth is coming very soon. and then the government has not taken measures to educate the people about the time frame from which they can actually benefit from that and how the benefit will spill over to the economy. So some of the people, it's an area where they practice the agriculture, but then most of the farmers have now thrown away their house because they feel like, okay, the gas economy is coming. So there are this challenge of expectation. I think this is the problem that is happening in Tanzania, just as it happened in Guinea. But I think there are weaknesses in terms of different actors to inform the citizens about how to manage the expectation. I think civil society organizations should, and of course the journalists, should have taken the proaction to educate the people about to manage the expectation, but I think that's not happening. So that's the experience of Tanzania. But then I have a question maybe to Zeinab that can help Tanzania in the future. She's actually saying that transparency has improved in Guinea. They are now publishing their contracts in the website. Of course, they have a problem, as you pointed out. Very few people are accessing the website. But my question is that the language of the contract is very technical. I can understand, even myself, some of the terms that they are used, they are legal terms, I cannot understand it. Now, how do the government take measures, even if they put them in the website, to make sure that the language in the contract is simple for a common person, a common Guinean, to understand the benefits out of the contract? Thank you.
Thank you. Back to Zeinab.
Thank you. I think that's what I was saying, that the government needs to go further and have sessions at the local level to explain, first of all, to the local governors, prefects, for example, because those are the people that we enforce those laws at the local level. But what we say that it is not done. It's just people at the ministry that understand the content of those laws, put on the website. Sometimes even parliament, members of parliament, do not have a sufficient insight of those laws. So can you just imagine the normal Guineans? So that's, first of all, is parliament members need to understand, get involved in understanding the inside of the law. It might not be all the technical thing, but the important thing for the population. Secondly, it has to go then at the local level, like we do with our stakeholders in consultation. We go to prefectures, have run consultation and discussion with the communities, and explaining to them the content of those laws in the local language, as you're right, because not all of them understand French, and those legislations are in French. So local languages are also important. So from all the phases, those communication needs to be done, because otherwise it creates misunderstanding and then creates doubt between the people and the government. So those kind of consultation should be done at the local level and in local language.
Thanks. And let me take this opportunity to ask Roberto, because a question has come through Twitter. A couple of questions are coming in. From Mukasiri Sibanda, how can state equity participation, which Mexico will still have a lot, Pemex and related, how can that state equity participation be leveraged to plug resource revenue leakages? Now, it may not totally apply to Mexico, but from general experience, but I think Mukasiri is referring to leakages is usually a code word for corruption, and money's going the wrong way and being misused or mismanaged. Now, I'm not sure, and it can go either way, whether it's leverage by the state participation means that they should have more control or less, because that may be part of the problem or the solution. But if you have insights from both Mexico and other countries. But this also brings opportunity of something that has not been discussed sufficiently. The issue may not just be about proper communication and information. There is also the problem of corruption, and leakage.
Well, in that sense, I would like to add first in the case of Mexico and then in general. At least in the case of Mexico, what happened is that with the revamp of the energy sector, the government state that since things would now start from scratch, they devised something called Round Zero. So in Mexico's case, I mean, for nearly since the expropriation of the oil and gas sector, Pemex, the national oil company, has been in charge of producing, refining, and transporting and delivering most of the oil and gas products in Mexico. So basically, what they happened is that to abolish Pemex would be suicide. So they thought if we are opening now to private competition, then what we will make is like introduce competition and make Pemex more competitive. But the problem right now, and I think this comes to the very fact that there is no necessarily intrinsically better regime in terms of whether national oil companies should take the lead, or could it be international oil companies. I think the point here is that whichever option you choose, I mean, governments, the point is to introduce competition, and at the very end that you achieve cost-effective solutions, not only for the sector as a whole, I mean, in terms of technology, for example, and cost-effectiveness in delivering resources, but for the citizens, which is a ultimate goal, you need to have reliable, affordable, and competitive energy options. So in that sense, I would say that, especially what happened with Mexico is at this point kind of unclear, in the sense that Pemex was given most of the resources, and many people, I mean, the signals for the market are, okay, you are introducing competition, but what kind of competition are you introducing if you're giving Pemex all of the shares, and besides it has a not very clean track of transparency and performance. So in this point, I would like to say that really what is very important is that whatever you do, you dissociate the national oil company from your ministries of energy, of finance, whatever, and that you don't interfere politically with that, and that you really ensure that your national oil companies or your companies or your industry, for that matter, is really dissociated from political interference. And I think one way to do that very effectively is to put the system of checks and balance, and to track it and to provide open access to information so that everybody, any citizen, could track it and be aware of that.
Excellent. And it's also a reminder about the importance of the proper corporatization of these organizations, how meritocratic is the selection of its leadership, the governance of those boards. So much has gone wrong with so many of these state-owned enterprises. Right now, it's an enormous opportunity, not only because of the fall in oil prices, but because of the huge corruption scandal in Brazil. So Petrobras, it's a case study, and it needs the reforms that for political reasons they are forced to implement for getting it right for that. Which goes to your point of what Pemex are doing, but even going further in terms of the meritocratic approach and how to corporatize. And in that sense, while not being perfect, because I'm biased because I'm from Chile, but Codelco in Chile is an example that, yes, a state-owned enterprise in natural resources can get it right, but it has to be subject to market competition. It has to be subject to a market rigor. It can be listed also in exchanges. In some cases, it can be also very important to have participation from privates in those companies, joint ventures, as well as how the selection, and the appointments and the replacements of the leadership takes place, which has been usually totally politicized in so many different settings.
Sorry, I would just like to add, which comes to the point of capacity as well, because if you don't have the proper capacity, even you have the rules, but right. You have all the theory, but you're not able to put it in practice. I mean, at the very end, you will be regulatory capture, corruption, lack of transparency, and at the very end, a very poor performance is basically what you will get, especially if you politicize these aspects, technical aspects of natural resource development.
And an extreme example in Latin America is PDVSA from Venezuela. So we're traveling very much north from Chile to Mexico, and let's leap again to Canada, okay, to get another perspective from Canada. Then, if it's okay with you, we will allocate 10 more minutes. We started about 10 minutes late, but I think this is a very rich discussion, and I know then many people are eager for the reception and so on. So Andrew, introduce yourself.
Andrew Bauer, Senior Economic Analyst at NRGI. Usually
from Canada.
From Canada. So usually when somebody praises Canada, my chest pumps up with Canadian pride. Unfortunately, I think this is one of the few cases where I can't do that. I think a lot of people confuse Canada for a country that does resource governance well, because we do two things actually well. We have rule of law, and we're very good at public financial management. When we say we're going to build a 100-kilometer road to a certain standard, that's what we build. But there are a number of areas when it comes to resource governance where I think we're less good, and I'd like to get to one of the points that Roberto made. For example, on environmental standards. One of the things to understand is each province has its own regulator and regulates the sector. So there's a wide variety of experiences. But as you may have heard recently, we had the biggest environmental disaster of the decade just a few months ago. A tailings pond broke at Mount Poly, dumping millions of tons of sludge into a river. It's a good example of the lack of proper environmental regulations. And that particular piece of regulation that you were referring to, actually what happened was the environmental standards were reduced. The petroleum industry actually wrote that piece of legislation, because the current government's very close to the petroleum industry, and they essentially watered down all of the environmental regulations so they could build a pipeline from the oil fields to the West Coast so they can pipe oil to China. Because there's this logjam in the US Congress about the Keystone Pipeline. So that's not, so the environmental regulations a little bit less. When it comes to government take, our taxation of the sector, it's also one of the lowest on earth, at least on paper. We basically give away a lot of our minerals or oil for free, or nearly free, because of tax incentives. And then even, I don't know if you may have heard, but in the oil-rich province of Alberta, and this gets to the topic of the discussion, they're very, very oil dependent. And what's happened is, they've had years and years and years of windfall revenues that they have not saved. And they never had a lot of debt, but they just didn't save it. And now, for the first time, they're in massive deficit, and they're cutting spending. And they're completely unprepared, and they're going to create a sales tax, and there are all these different ideas floating about. But they've really not managed that sector or those revenues very well. So I think it's just, we need there are good things and bad things about Canada, but I think we need a nuanced perspective on that.
Well, let me take the opportunity, since Canada and also you work in the US, and because just another Twitter comes in, and you just mentioned the environmental issues. So you mentioned some of the challenges that Canada still had, but you also mentioned some of the achievements, including on environmental issues. How should climate change / unburnable carbon considerations bear on extractives, on the master planning and policy making of extractives, from Jeremy Wheat? And in that context, we know that many countries have, because of the drop of policy prices, one of the opportunities that arose, and they're seizing on it, they're reducing subsidies, right, already. How many are increasing taxes on carbon is another matter, and so on. But from your perspective on Canada, US?
You're my president. Do we have an institutional position on climate change?
No, but how, what?
No, I mean, yeah, I think that there's obviously, yeah, like you said, the fuel subsidies is a perfect example. I think there are lots of opportunities from the reduction in commodity prices to bring about reforms. Mongolia is a great example. In Mongolia, they're talking about creating a new sovereign wealth fund with new fiscal rules and new, because they didn't save their windfall revenues before, and now they feel like this is an opportunity where they can create those institutions because there's no pressure to spend because there's no money. But the same thing with fuel subsidies is, the cost of fuel subsidies is going down now that oil prices have gone down. So it's a perfect opportunity to cut some of those subsidies and then reduce consumption of resources. But one of the things that I think we can also think about, or link the resource sector to climate change, is, and actually I heard this in the Indonesian context, earmarking resource revenues for certain things like, renewable renewable energies. And that's like I think a good policy option. But in terms of, should we be extracting? Personally, I don't think you tell a country like Mali, where the average salary is $300 a year, to not extract because of climate change.
Let's move on. Great. There was a hand raised earlier by one of you, but if not, let's go to you and then to Jalson.
Thank you for the opportunity as well. I would apologize to sit down so I can maneuver to look on my...
Introduce yourself first.
Okay. My name is Samuel Bequin. I'm with NRGI in Accra office. I will speak for the Ghana situation so that other neighboring countries and other African countries or even other regional countries could learn from what is happening.
Sam, brief, because there are a few others.
So we discovered oil in 2007. The main issue is that we borrowed a lot. Everybody heard about Ghana borrowing $3 billion from China, and later we cut it to $1.5 billion. So the deficit was going up, and then the government also introduced this salaries increase, single span, where it was level for government workers to receive higher salaries. The impact of the current falling prices is, as Danny said, it's like a fig leaf. The situation was that Ghana created this PRMA, which is Petroleum Revenue Management Act, which was hailed internationally, not only locally, to create like a stabilization fund to manage volatility. But the issue is that the general fiscal discipline is very bad, and that was the issue. We should have solved that situation before we introduced this for only oil. And I think I agree with Professor Paul as well. So the main impact is that now it has come to expose the issues in Ghana. So the cut in the minister came up with the cut. So the benchmark price that was used was 99.8, but this has been confused in the whole country as benchmark being like a forecasted price, but it is not. And then now they are adopting IMF price, which is 52.8, and the minister is saying that. So this went down by 47% in terms of the price change, but the cuts have gone down by 64.4%. So the government is now adjusting through spending cuts, and then we cannot save anything now. And the last issue is the proposals to amend the PRMA. Now, when this happens, people think, even the government think that the PRMA has a problem or has an issue in terms of how it calculates the benchmark revenue. And now the government has a proposal which will mean that the Minister of Finance every year would be able to go to Parliament and change whenever price changes in terms of how much he thinks it seems right to use as a benchmark price. And I think this will follow what Andrew has always been talking about the scenario for Chile and the scenario for Venezuela, where whenever there is a price fall, your spendings go down much with the price. And whenever there is a price increase, your spending will go up. And the last issue that I will mention here is that in terms of the new proposals, the government want to fix savings 30%. Before, it was savings on excess of benchmark revenue. But now the government want to fix savings. Every year they are saving 30% in the new proposals, which means that whenever there is a price boom, they are saving. Whenever there is a dip where you don't need to save, they are still saving. And I don't know how that will make the PRMA work very well, because the issue for, the main thing about benchmark revenue is to smooth your spending. And now when you save, you fixed your savings, and then you spend 70% every year. And that's going to give the government fiscal space to spend more whenever there is a boom, because now he has been restricted with the benchmark revenue formula. And I think this is what the oil price fall has affected us. We had a problem already. It has come to expose the fiscal challenges that we had before. And the government have used this as a vehicle to tell the whole country that the problem we are having now is because of the oil price fall. And I think that is something that we have a very good law, but it's not well implemented.
Thanks.
Perhaps another very important
introduce.
My name is Adams Fesheni, also from the Accra office of NRGI. A lot has been said, so I only just want to add one area of interest. Transparency without accountability is not complete. While the laws and regulations are being put in place, one very important part is the extent to which, indeed, these have been shared with citizens in the fullest extent possible. And in this particular case, we're talking of contracts. The law says that they have to be published. But in the last few years, not much has been known. And earlier we heard in the course of the discussion with Sir Paul Collier, the issue of raising expectations, which can stem from lack of information. In this particular case, while the political elite will agree that the contracts are transparent, they are only transparent to the extent that they know what is inside, but not citizens. And interestingly, even political parties on different sides of the aisle will rise to defend each other, that they are available when citizens have no access to them. So a very important lesson is, are we learning enough from the case of Nigeria? 50 years of exploration. Lack of accountability, but availability of laws. To what extent can we learn better?
Okay. Gelson, quickly, and then we'll turn to you 1 minute each to encompass this, so and then we'll be concluding.
Gelson Garcia here. I'm the new Asia Pacific Director of NRGI. I'm based in I'm originally from the Philippines, but I have a question to the two panelists. I think the common discourse surrounding the falling price of oil seems to be focused more on the need to fix your savings and expenditures. But there's a lot of quarters in Asia where people are looking at this falling oil price as an opportunity to revisit the oil, the energy policy options in the country. In other words, if we're going to put the price of oil in the context of energy, there's a number of countries in Asia, many of them are still oil and gas rich, but they are still suffering from energy poverty. You know, whether they are dependent on oil, gas, or coal. China, India, for example, or even in Indonesia, there's still some percentage in the population that still needs many of its poor population to have decent access to electricity. So I think my question to you is that isn't this also an important opportunity to revisit the energy policy options of many governments, where currently there are many governments wherein their energy options is very much providing a so-called perverse incentives to industry that are getting oil subsidies, while you're still seeing many of these poor population that are not getting, you know, this energy. So isn't it just time to review, for example, the energy efficient technologies as opposed to simply be dependent on oil? Isn't this the time also to look at the renewable energy alternatives that are also present in many of these countries that do not need to be very much dependent on grid, but maybe they are best placed to look at, you know, decentralized, you know, energy planning. So I think this is the question for you. And if this is an opportunity, what would be the fiscal and policy incentives needed to address this? Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, the irony to economists of that very good question is that as oil prices plummet, the incentive in terms of consumption is towards oil and against the alternative sources. So the fiscal incentive and other issues are particularly important. Let's go to why don't we reverse it? Let's go to you first, Zeinab, and just summarizing some of the answers to a concluding question and your final punchline, okay. And the same then with Roberto. Okay.
I'm going to touch on mining, not oil and gas. I don't want to venture on that path, but I think it's the same approach. For me, the development and the benefit of natural resources should be taken holistically. So we cannot talk about mining natural resources mining without talking about infrastructure, without talking about energy. For me, it goes hands in hands. So that's why I said having a vision and strategy is really important to see where we need to go and which are the reforms that needs to be put in place to be able to reap the benefits. Because we can change the mining laws or the energy, but if there's no synergy between all those sectors, we won't have any impact. So for me, do not take one part as a silo, but it has to be a holistic way of approaching the situation.
Thanks.
Well, in my case, I think like they say, crisis, or in this case, low oil prices are opportunities for change. In my view, I don't see that particularly renewables are growing. I mean, not because of low oil prices. I think it's the other way around. More countries, and especially in some areas, maybe what you will see is that they'll start shifting from burning unsustainable, I don't know, firewood or that kind of non-commercial energies, and maybe they will transition to oil, or hopefully, and natural gas. But honestly, I don't see that without government incentives. I don't see renewables by themselves growing significantly. And as for energy policies, yeah, I think that I quite agree with what Zeinab said, in the sense that you need to address it holistically, and whatever you do, you need to think in terms of the long term rather than the short term, and to assess in that sense all of the risks and all of the advantages that could possibly be brought about with that kind of initiatives. That's it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I will take the prerogative for being the provocateur, as I'm called, and discussant, and take the last question that came also through Twitter, and because I happen to be also in the international board of EITI, the question is about it. Do you think if the focus on revenues, I guess the meaning is the exclusive focus on revenues, rather than ownership or on expenditures, was in retrospect problematic for EITI? And let me very quickly answer, because this applies in general to our whole field. I think that the perfect is the enemy of the good. I don't think the initial focus of EITI was, in fact, in sunshine being the best disinfectant and disclosure of revenues. And revenues was very much that emphasis. And the fact that it was such a focus, and revenues usually is a lower hanging fruit politically in terms of disclosure. There have been already budget transparency around the world that allowed for much more consensus in a multi-sectoral fashion, which is a great innovation of EITI, of industry, of investors, of governments and civil society working together. And that happened. Now over time and over the years, it was recognized that that's obviously not enough. So the old rules, the focus was on revenues. Now it's much broader. And we're going to be going over that in the coming days. And it does cover many other issues, including the SOEs, including the whole issue of ownership. Beneficiary ownership is becoming part of it. And I think that would not have happened if it was too ambitious and one tried to be perfect. There would not have been that consensus early on. Instead, I would say that right now, the big challenge for EITI to remain relevant is for all these disclosures to be much more timely, much more on time, on a quarterly or monthly basis, even rather than reports that come 2 or 3 years late, and in a very, as the great comment from Tanzania, in a user-friendly fashion that can be communicated very widely, can be shared by all the local NGOs, think tanks, and used much more effectively for mass communications, rather than these huge PDF reports, which are extremely difficult to digest. This is being discussed as we speak as part of EITI. And the other big challenge is to take very seriously in the next stage the absolutely crucial importance of translating transparency or disclosure on the books, technical transparency, to effective accountability by allowing civil society and giving them the space and the enable environment and empowering them to basically be able to make the governments accountable as the question. In that context, contract transparency, which is not mentioned in this question, is absolutely crucial. And let me finish on contract transparency with a quick comment, because your great question and the great advances that are taking place in Guinea, and point out that in fact, in the case of this resourcecontracts.org that I mentioned before, which is online, and also in the French equivalent, sorry for my accent, contractminierguinee.org, they all include plain language summaries of the key terms, and they are designed in particular to facilitate this mass dissemination issue. And the hope and the expectation is to be able to make that universal. There are a number of other countries and where contracts are coming on board, but the whole movement towards contract transparency is absolutely critical. There are many companies that are still resisting it, while others are saying enough is enough, and we need to be more transparent. So yes, beneficiary ownership issues need to be more transparent. The whole focus on expenditures, and we heard in the earlier lectures, but also now on contracts nets, and basically working all together so that the enable environment for civil society, for think tanks, for all the other stakeholders, parliaments, to be able to do the effective work on accountability and promote the reforms that are needed. Without that pressure, in many contexts, that will not happen just because of one government reformist alone will not be able to do it. So that's my take on that question on EITI. Big challenges ahead, but I think in terms of the progression, one seizes an opportunity, even if it's good at the beginning but not perfect, and one builds on that. And this is now the time to build much more on that. And that applies to all of our work. Let me thank first the great panelists and also the audience, and a round of applause for everybody and for the tweeters.